Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's ocean class, a journey through the kelp forest. Today I'll be guiding you through the fascinating world of kelp forests, what they are, why they're important, where we can find them in the world, what makes them unique, and what they mean to us as humans. Most importantly, we'll discuss what we need to do to protect this incredibly valuable ecosystem. I'm Xu, and I'm the program lead at the Kelp Forest Foundation. Our foundation has the goal to protect and restore wild kelp forest, promote sustainable kelp farming, and conservation efforts to ensure these ecosystems thrive for future generations. So let's get started on our topic today. Let me introduce you to kelp. Kelp is a type of seaweed, and seaweeds are macroalgae, meaning that they are larger, plant-like organisms that grow in the ocean waters. Seaweed comes in many sizes and forms, but kelp is one of the biggest and fastest growing types of seaweed. Kelp belongs to the brown algae family and can form large underwater forests. Some species of kelp can grow over 40 meters, which is about 120 feet long, and they are important homes for marine life. At first glance, you could compare kelp with land plants, but unlike land plants, kelp do not have roots. They also don't have any stems or leaves. Instead, it has a similar structure, such as, first of all, a holdfast. The holdfast is kind of like a foot or a root-like structure that helps the kelp anchor itself to the rocks or the seafloor. Kelp needs a hard substrate to grow on. So it really likes to attach to surfaces like concrete, but also to rocks and other harder materials like ropes. Then we'll see the stipe, which looks a little bit like a stem or a trunk or a branch. And from these stipes, we have blades that grow. Blades look a lot like leaves, and the blades help the kelp capture sunlight for photosynthesis. Some kelps even have something called a pneumaticist, which are gas bladders, and these help the kelp float towards the surface to reach the sunlight. And if you look at the image here on the right, you can see how different kelp is from land plants. So now we know a little bit about one type of kelp. Let's look at the different types of kelp that exist. Currently, we know about 33 genera of kelp, and there are 112 species of kelp known. Some of them are a bit more known than the others. On the image here, you can see the most prominent species. For example, giant kelp, one of the world's fastest growing organisms. They are known to form really large forests underwater. Some other species are more known for food consumptions, like wakame or konbu, mostly known in Asian cuisine. Then we have a few other types that are known around our coastal areas, like bull kelp, oarweed, and golden kelp. These kelps that are described on the photo are the ones that are most commonly known, mostly for the ecosystem role or their commercial value. Now let's learn a little bit about the history of kelp. Kelp forests have been around for millions of years. The brown algae group, to which kelp belongs, actually evolved around 600 to 800 million years ago. Fossil evidence suggests that kelp forests existed as early as the Miocene epoch, which is about 5 to 23 million years ago. They existed alongside the ancestors of what we know as our modern whales and seals. And some of the unique adaptations of kelp is a couple of things. First of all, its flexible stipe, which allows it to bend with ocean currents without breaking. Also, the holdfast I was just talking about allowed the kelp to anchor itself to the seabed and preventing the kelp from being swept away by waves and currents. Now let's look at another thing that's unique about kelp. Kelp has a very unique life cycle that includes two distinct stages. First, you'll have the large visible sporophyte, the kelp that we see in the ocean, and a microscopic gametophyte, which is their reproductive stage. This process, called alternation of generations, is similar to the life cycle of ferns, but then obviously it happens entirely underwater. In the first stage, we have the sporophyte. Like I said, this is the kelp that we can see and are most familiar with. When the kelp matures, it develops special reproductive structures that release spores into the water. We call this the fertile material. It becomes the part of a blade which we call a sorus tissue. This part of the tissue releases spores, and these spores can contain half of the genetic material, and it drifts into the ocean currents. Then we start the reproductive stage. From the spores, the gametophyte develops. And a gametophyte is a stage that is too small to see with the naked eye. Gametophytes then produce sperm and eggs, which combine through fertilization to form a zygote. The zygote then develops into a new sporophyte, and it grows rapidly. As it matures, it creates a new generation of spores, continuing the cycle. It's important to understand this cycle because this will help us support conservation efforts and sustainable kelp farming. It allows us to reproduce kelp in a controlled way. Now, let's zoom out a little bit and talk about where kelp forests like to live. Kelp forests are usually found in areas with cold, nutrient-rich waters, such as the Pacific Northwest, Australia, South Africa, and Japan. What a kelp forest eventually looks like is what you see here. Kelp forests are very much like underwater jungles. They form complex ecosystems where marine species live, feed, and reproduce. Just like forests on land, there are different layers to the structure of a kelp forest. First, you'll have the top, which we call a canopy. And a canopy is formed by floating kelp fronds at the water surface, providing shade and protection. Not all kelp types actually are able to form a canopy, but when they do, you see it just like in the image. It shows that it's similar to the top of a forest, and it creates the shade and protection for the rest of the water. Then you look at the different layer, which is the water column. In this layer, you will find the long stipes that act a lot like trunks or branches, and they connect the canopy of the kelp to the ocean floor. And then finally, you'll have the bottom, which we call the understory. This is the area that's close to the seafloor, where smaller seaweeds and marine creatures thrive. With these different layers, the kelp forest create a biodiverse habitat, and they help support everything from tiny invertebrates to large predators like sea otters and sharks. Speaking of these other animals, let's dive into the kelp forest food web. We often talk about the marine habitat that the kelp forests provide, and kelp forests are actually one of the ocean's richest habitats, supporting incredible biodiversity. Kelp forests are underwater forests that provide food, shelter, and protection for a lot of other marine species, from tiny invertebrates and fish to sea otters and whales. By forming the foundation for intricate food webs, kelp ecosystems illustrate just how interconnected marine life truly is. We can talk about the food web of a kelp forest in a way of a food pyramid. This is a technical term that describes how energy flows within an ecosystem and how species depend on each other. In ecosystems, energy flows through organisms in a complex network, which we call a food web. Think of it like an interconnected map showing who eats who within a community. Unlike simple food chains, food webs demonstrate multiple feeding relationships and reveal how species depend on each other in different ways. They also help us visualize the true complexity of nature, making it clear how changing one species or changes that happen to one species can actually have a ripple effect through the entire ecosystem, impacting many other species that live within it. So, looking at the different layers, we can start with the kelp. Just like trees in a forest, kelp, but also phytoplankton, is able to capture sunlight and convert it into energy, and this forms the base of an ecosystem. The fact that they can perform photosynthesis, and turn abiotic sources into energy, makes them primary producers. Then what follows is species that feed directly on kelp or the organic matter that it sheds. We call these herbivores or grazers. These are also called our primary consumers. In a kelp forest, this means sea urchins. They can also become major grazers that can destroy kelp forest if left unchecked. But there are also other herbivores in these ecosystems, for example, abalone, snails, and other crustaceans. From there, we'll have the secondary consumers. These are animals that prey on herbivores and help control their populations. These are usually smaller fish, sea star, and octopus. Then, the next layer is supported by top predators and tertiary consumers. These are the bigger fishes that eat the smaller fish, like the sea star and octopus. We often see these top predators and tertiary consumers being seals, sea lions, and sharks, but also dolphins and whales. These predators keep fish and urchin populations in check and are important keystone species. An interesting species that we find in kelp forest is also a sea otter, who not only feeds on the smaller fish, so the secondary consumers, but also feed directly on sea urchins. Sea otters actually play a really important role in keeping sea urchin populations in check. To close the pyramid, we have decomposers and nutrient cyclers. These species recycle the nutrients back into the ecosystem. This includes mussels, barnacles, bacteria, and fungi. Looking at this pyramid, we see that each species play an important role in keeping the kelp forest healthy. If predators like sea otters disappear, sea urchins overpopulate and they destroy kelp forest. Without kelp, though, many marine species also lose their habitat and food. What the image also demonstrates is that when energy moves up a food pyramid, most of it gets used up along the way. At each level of the pyramid, only about 10% of the energy from the level below passes on to the next stage. The other 90% is lost as heat, when animals breathe, digest food, move around, and keep their bodies working. Because so much energy is lost at every step, fewer animals can survive at higher levels of the pyramid. This is why we usually see a lot of plants and small animals at the bottom and fewer larger animals at the top. And this ultimately forms the pyramid shape. Now we've learned about the impact of a kelp forest on biodiversity and its role as a marine habitat. We can also look at the other ecosystem services that kelp provide. Ecosystem services are those services provided by an ecosystem to nature and us human beings. What we see, kelp forests are able to sequester carbon. The way kelp does that is by absorbing CO2 from the water surrounding it, and the carbon is then stored in its biomass. When old kelp, when it dies off, drifts into the deep sea, some of the carbon gets permanently stored, and this helps fight climate change. Kelp is also able to remove excess nutrients, such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which then helps prevent harmful algal blooms and keeping the ocean ecosystems balanced. Like we've just talked about, kelp is also an important foundation species on which fish, invertebrates, and marine mammals depend. We also see that a lot of smaller fish use kelp forest as a shelter and as a breeding ground. For example, herring are known to lay their eggs on kelp blades and forming a house for their eggs. Now we know a bit about the value of kelp forests as a whole. We can dive into other practices that we know about kelp. For example, kelp farming. Kelp farming is an exciting and sustainable form of aquaculture, sometimes specifically called mariculture. This involves cultivating kelp from tiny seedlings all the way to full-grown plants ready for harvest. To successfully farm kelp, growers typically start by establishing a hatchery. Think of this hatchery like a nursery, where kelp seedlings are carefully nurtured in tanks under controlled environments. This stage is crucial because it significantly boosts the chances that young kelp plants will thrive once they are placed into the open ocean. In these hatcheries, kelp seedlings initially grow on thin strings or ropes. We often call this twine. Once they've grown strong enough, these ropes are then transferred out into the sea, where they are secured to larger structures or anchored lines. These underwater ropes essentially become the farmlands, allowing the kelp to expand rapidly in these nutrient-rich waters of the ocean. Not only does this method ensure a reliable and abundant harvest, but it can also have added ecological benefits, like improving water quality and providing habitats for marine life. But it is important that we do kelp farming in a responsible way. Kelp farming and the use of kelp has been around for centuries. Looking at the history, we can start in the 17th century, where Japan was already cultivating kombu for food. Looking at the 19th century, kelp was also widely used for potash production. This was an essential activity for soap and glass manufacturing, and mostly happened in Scotland and Ireland. In the 20th century, kelp became an industrial source for agar, alginates, and thickening agents in Japan, China, and Chile. And finally, in the last few years or last decades, kelp farming has become very popular and interesting because we are starting to recognize the environmental benefits and commercial uses of kelp. We're only discovering more and more ways of using kelp, which we'll dive into later. Kelp farming, like I said, has a lot of good benefits. Sustainable kelp farming can be a tool for climate resilience, economic development, and marine conservation. Growing kelp can have a positive effect on the ocean water quality. Kelp is able to absorb excess nutrients and carbon. It can help oxygen levels by increasing it through this process, and therefore create more favorable conditions for other organisms that live in the ocean water. At the same time, the harvested kelp can turn into many other products that are beneficial. We will discuss this later. Kelp farming, compared to other farming and land farming, is quite beneficial. Kelp farming does not require any land, no fresh water, and little human intervention. And at the same time, it provides a sustainable source of food and materials. It can also create coastal protection against erosion, and it helps restore marine habitats and biodiversity. But with any type of farming, it is important that we do it sustainably and responsibly. Ways in which we can do that is, for example, selecting our species. We need to make sure that the kelp species that we farm are not invasive to other species that are growing nearby. We also need to take into account the amount of kelp that is farmed in a single place and ensure a balanced ecosystem. Activities on land and ocean related to kelp farming can also have its own environmental impact. We still need fuels and materials to build our kelp farm. Whenever we can, we need to make sure that these materials are eco-friendly and sustainable. Now that we know about kelp farming, it will be interesting to look at how we can use kelp in different ways. There's actually been quite a history of kelp use. Kelp has always been an important resource for coastal communities, already for centuries. Indigenous groups around the world have traditionally used kelp for a variety of purposes. In the Pacific Northwest, for example, people have used bull kelp to make ropes, fishing lines, and even storage containers. Kelp has also played a role in art and storytelling, and therefore reflects a deep cultural significance in many traditions. Nowadays, we're not using kelp only to produce fishing line and ropes. Kelp can be used as an ingredient to create many other products, and we are just discovering the potential of this beautiful organism. Kelp can be harvested and turned into food, animal feed, fish feed, bioplastics, biofuels, and fertilizers. It is also a key ingredient in cosmetics and dietary supplements because it's high in iodine, vitamin, and mineral content. We therefore see an important role that kelp can play in making our industries more sustainable. Imagine a world where single-use plastics can be replaced with kelp. Or kelp can reduce our need for chemical fertilizers, as kelp biostimulants can help improve soil health and bring nutrients back from the ocean. Next to its role within industries, we see that kelp farming has an important role with supporting communities and women. Kelp farming offers a pathway for economic independence and sustainable livelihoods for women in coastal communities, particularly seen in Asia, Africa, and Latin American countries. However, despite their role in seaweed farming, women often face barriers such as limited access to resources, training, and fair wages. Supporting women in this industry not only strengthens the local economies, but also contributes to environmental conservation and climate resilience. It helps us drive sustainable development in vulnerable regions. While there is more and more reason that we know that kelp forests are important, kelp forests unfortunately are under threat. Around 50% of the global kelp forests have already declined in the past 50 years. In some regions, this is even worse. For example, in Tasmania, we've seen losses of kelp forest of over 90%. There are different reasons why it's not going very well with kelp forest in several places. And this is something that is happening globally. The key cause for kelp loss is actually overfishing. And sometimes we also see large events like tsunamis that can have a major effect. What happens is that we lose predators, the natural predator of sea urchins. As a result, an explosion of sea urchin populations who then overgraze the kelp, causing massive losses. We'll dive into this more specifically in the next slide. We also see other causes of kelp loss, one of them being our changing climate. We've seen marine heat waves which make the waters of the kelp unfavorable. As said before, kelp needs cold, nutrient-rich waters. And just like we see in coral reefs, if there's a marine heat wave, it can actually have a negative impact on the kelp, causing kelp loss. Another reason for kelp loss is pollution. For example, coastal development by human beings and also other industrial activities that we do can lead into bad water quality and also more sediment pollution that can cover the kelp forest, essentially suffocating these important species. As with other ecological problems that we face in the world, it is important that we change our behavior and that we find a way to motivate people, organizations, and governments to do their best in protecting these important ecosystems. Let's dive into the issue of restoring kelp forest and urchin barrens. The good news is that kelp forest can bounce back, sometimes surprisingly fast. One key factor of kelp forest restoration is managing sea urchin populations. Like I just said, sea urchins are one of the main causes for kelp forest loss. Sea urchins is an important part of the ecosystem of kelp forests. They naturally graze on kelp, and that's fine in small numbers. But when their natural predators like sea otters disappear or decline, the urchins multiply out of control. They then create what we call urchin barrens, areas of the ocean floor covered almost entirely by hungry sea urchins, with very little kelp or other marine life left. To visualize this, imagine a thriving underwater forest full of fish, crabs, and sea stars, and this suddenly transforming into a bare underwater desert dominated by sea urchins. This is an urchin barren, what you can also see on the photo on the left. According to marine scientist Aaron Eager, when you reach a density of more than 10 or more urchins per square meter, you're close to a dangerous tipping point. At this density, kelp forests begin to disappear rapidly because the urchins devour the kelp faster than it can regrow. However, if we bring sea urchin numbers back down, kelp can rebound impressively fast. If we bring the urchin population down to fewer than 2 per square meter, kelp can regenerate naturally. Compared to restoring land-based ecosystems like forests, which can take decades or even centuries, kelp forests can regrow rapidly, sometimes adding several inches of kelp forest per day. This speedy recovery allows marine life to return quickly, restoring balance to the ecosystem and bringing back the rich biodiversity we know with these healthy oceans. The healthier the kelp forest, the more fish there is, the more food, and the more jobs and a healthy coastal community we have. Still, it's crucial to remember that preventing an ecosystem from becoming an urchin barren is the most effective strategy. It takes us less resources and much less effort to keep a kelp forest healthy than it does to restore one from scratch. The moment we reduce sea urchins below that tipping point, we start seeing rapid and exciting signs of recovery. So, how can we protect kelp forests? Although kelp forests are typically associated with cooler waters, the lessons learned from kelp conservation apply to everywhere else too. Proactive management and preservation of local marine habitats, such as coral reefs and seagrass beds, help us ensure vibrant coastal communities and sustainable fisheries for generations. Ultimately, the health of our oceans depends on balanced ecosystems, and kelp forests clearly demonstrate this. By understanding the delicate balance between kelp, sea urchins, and all their other ecosystem species, like their predators, we see just how quickly marine life can recover, just when we give them the right support. As long as we remember that proactive conservation isn't just about preserving nature, it is really about protecting our own future and the communities that depend on healthy oceans. I want to thank you for joining us today and continue working together to safeguard these underwater habitats. It's important that we fight for our healthy oceans.